Last time we spoke about how Hitler's summer triumph turned bitter. Initially buoyed by early victories, the Wehrmacht led by General Fedor von Bock aimed to capture Moscow by encircling the critical city of Smolensk. However, under the leadership of Marshal Semyon Timoshenko, the Red Army mounted an unexpectedly resilient defense. Despite suffering heavy losses, Soviet forces regrouped and undertook strategic reforms, relocating factories to enhance their production of tanks and aircraft. The situation intensified on July the 15th as intense battles erupted in Smolensk, with German troops managing to encircle the city. As the Germans celebrated capturing Smolensk on July the 16th, the broader picture reflected a grim reality. Their supply lines stretched thin, and casualties were mounting. Amid shifting dynamics, the Red Army showcased formidable spirit and adaptability, hinting at a turning point in the war. Though Smolensk fell, the fierce resistance and evolving tactics foreshadowed challenges to come for the Wehrmacht, revealing the struggle and determination of those fighting on the Eastern Front. This episode is Hitler's Orders versus Reality, Chaos on the Eastern Front. Well, hello there, and welcome back to the Eastern Front Week by Week podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II, and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube, and continue to produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. And after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. Over at Echoes of War, we're about to release a multi-part series covering the Philippines campaign of World War II. If you'd like to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/PacificWarChannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series. It's about 28 episodes and ongoing at this point, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. As August of 1941 unfolded, the once unshakable illusion of the swift German victory began to show signs of fracture. In the 9th podcast of our Eastern Front Week by Week series, the Wehrmacht finds itself in a very precarious position, trapped between encircled Soviet forces and a resilient Red Army that refuses to succumb to defeat. At Smolensk, a significant city located in western Russia, the Soviets defy expectations by reopening the encirclement just days after it had been sealed. This audacious maneuver compels the German panzer groups, renowned for their rapid mobility, to delay their much-needed rest and refitting. The harsh reality of warfare sets in as the promised quick victory turns into a struggle against the relentless Soviet defenders. To the south, the Uman encirclement, a brutal confrontation in Ukraine, concludes with staggering losses for the Soviet forces. The cost in terms of men and resources begins to mount alarmingly for the invaders. The expansive fields of Ukraine become a graveyard for both sides, with each loss fueling the fires of the conflict. Meanwhile, the Red Army is not standing idle. They mobilize millions of personnel from their vast reserves, forming new field armies even as their older counterparts are systematically dismantled on the battlefield. This resilience is a testament to the Soviet spirit, embodying their commitment to defending their homeland against the Axis onslaught. In the northern sector, Army Group North prepares for a decisive push towards Leningrad, the jeweled city in the east, known for its historical and cultural significance. The forces commit their remaining strength in a desperate last-ditch effort to seize their vital urban center. The stakes are incredibly high as the city holds not only military importance but also symbolic value in the hearts of the Russian people. While the German offensive strength was increasingly waning, the Soviet Union launched one of its most remarkable mobilization programs in military history. During much of the 1920s and 1930s, the Red Army developed an extensive cadre system which maintained a small number of active-duty soldiers during peacetime, but could be rapidly expanded by reservists in time of war. To support this system, the Universal Military Service Law of 1938 extended the age of enlistment of Army reserves to 50 years old and established numerous new military schools to accommodate the influx of trainees. By the eve of the German invasion, the Red Army had built a mobilization base of over 14 million people. By the end of June of 1941, approximately 5.3 million reservists had been called up, with further mobilizations occurring in rapid succession. This cadre system allowed for an extraordinary rate of force generation, effectively outmaneuvering German intelligence estimates and obscuring the true strength of the Soviet military. In July of 1941, no fewer than 13 new field armies were formed, followed by an additional 14 in August. Although these newly constituted reserve armies were not as well equipped or trained as the professional soldiers they replaced, the changing tide of warfare began to favor them as German mobile forces weakened. As the conflict transitioned to positional warfare, these new armies had an opportunity to improve their training and tactics. While it's essential not to trivialize the scale of the military disaster experienced on the Western Front in Belarus, it remains true that the Soviet Union's force generation scheme allowed for a quick replenishment of its losses and a dramatic expansion of the Red Army's size. On June 22, 1941, the Red Army numbered 5,337,000 men. By August 31st, despite suffering significant losses, this figure had grown to about 6,889,000, and by December 31st, 1941, the Army reached an estimated 8 million personnel. After the war, German military leaders such as General Fritz Blumentritt acknowledged the fundamental issue of latent Soviet military strength. Reflecting on the German offensive plans aimed at encircling and destroying the Red Army before they could regroup behind the Dnieper and Dwina rivers, Blumentritt posed a haunting rhetorical question. But what if armies, millions strong, had not yet even been mobilized, and only parts of the Red Army were in western Russia? While the Soviet loss of tanks proved acutely felt, given that tanks were harder to replace, many historians have overstated the extent of the German successes. At the onset of the war, the Soviet tank inventory numbered an impressive 23,667 tanks. However, this total reflected Soviet production dating back to the 1920s and included many models that had become obsolete on the modern battlefield. Of this number, around 15,000 tanks were from the older T-26 and BT series, with estimates suggesting that the majority were in dire need of repair. Moreover, untrained crews, severe shortages of ammunition, fuel, and spare parts, as well as the absence of supporting arms like air cover, contributed to the scene of Soviet tanks littering the battlefields, even if they made it that far at all. Thus, the apparently staggering German successes, often highlighted by the sheer number of Soviet tanks destroyed, can be better understood as a disaster waiting to unfold for the Soviets. Inept planning and direction within the Soviet military profoundly affected the outcome, as the large quantities of outdated equipment inflated the perception of German victory. In reality, even without these specific blunders committed by the Soviets, the great bulk of their mechanized army was likely to struggle against the German forces. Yet what was fundamentally crucial for the future of the conflict was the production of new and more effective tanks. In this regard, Soviet leadership acted with notable resolve. Amid the relentless advance of the German forces, the gigantic evacuation of the Soviet industry to the east in 1941 became essential for ensuring the economic resilience of the Soviet Union. Undertaken with remarkable speed and under the most adverse circumstances, including aerial bombardments from the Luftwaffe, hundreds of factories were uprooted, transported deep into the interior, and rapidly reassembled. The scale and complexity of such an undertaking are hard to fathom, especially in light of the national crisis gripping the country. Here, the post-war Soviet literature's use of grandiose terms such as heroic and historic seems justified. Between July and November, a staggering 1,523 industrial enterprises were relocated to the Volga region, Siberia or Central Asia, amounting to an impressive 1.5 million railway wagon loads of equipment and materials. More remarkably, production of vital war materials actually increased in the later half of 1941, with official production figures for items like tanks being exceeded. Indeed, the Soviet Union produced more tanks in 1941 than Germany, with 66% of these being the newer T-34 and KV-1 models. Additionally, Soviet industry outproduced Germany in aircraft and artillery pieces, effectively meeting the immediate needs of the Red Army. In assessing the outcome of Germany's first major encirclement battle on the Eastern Front, it becomes apparent that the German military leadership overestimated the ramifications of their victories on the Soviet Union's ability to maintain a coherent front. Conversely, the Germans failed to effectively balance the demands of securing a tight perimeter around the eastern edge of their encirclement, with the necessity of swiftly capitalizing on their successes by continuing their advance. The root cause of this oversight, evident even in the early stages of the war, lay in a shortage of sufficient mobile forces needed to accomplish the tasks at hand. Consequently, as losses mounted and the campaign expanded towards more ambitious objectives over vast distances, the specter of overextension loomed even larger. These massive numbers represented just the initial wave of mobilization for the Soviet Union. In 1941, the nation had a staggering population of over 198 million people, in sharp contrast to Germany, which had a population of only 79 million. Furthermore, the average age of the German population was generally older than that of the Soviets, giving the USSR a significant advantage in recruitment. This demographic disparity meant that the Soviets had access to larger manpower pools to fulfill the country's diverse needs, ranging from labor in the mines and factories to soldiering in the armed forces. The effectiveness of this mobilization was clearly illustrated by the force generation numbers achieved by the Red Army thus far in the war. In July alone, the Red Army managed to field an impressive 13 new field armies. Many of these soldiers were little more than inexperienced conscripts at the outset of their service, yet they engaged in combat, they accumulated invaluable experience, both individually and collectively as units under fire. Meanwhile, the leaky encirclements during the intense battles of June and July allowed numerous soldiers to return to the Red Army as veterans, bolstering its ranks with combat-experienced troops. These returning veterans helped to form a critical core of experienced personnel that would prove to be vital during the grueling autumn fighting, contributing not only to the immediate military efforts, but also to enhancing the overall resilience of the Red Army in the face of continued German aggression. The Wehrmacht was only beginning to encounter the early signs of manpower struggles that would plague it throughout the remainder of the conflict. In the first weeks of fighting on the Eastern Front, the German military experienced relatively moderate casualties compared to those incurred by the Soviet Union. However, each lost soldier represented a more significant challenge for the Germans, who were operating within a smaller man pool. The demands of the war economy were already exceeding what Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime could reasonably expect from the country, and domestic mobilization was essentially complete. Germany had commenced its campaign in the East with its best possible force, and was only destined to decline from that point onwards. Despite the staggering fact that more than 200 million people lived under Nazi control outside Germany itself, it would not be as straightforward as it might seem to conscript some of these millions to aid in the Nazi wars. Historically, figures like Napoleon Bonaparte had successfully enlisted tens of thousands of soldiers from across Europe during his conquests. Nazi Germany would employ small numbers of soldiers from the occupied territories as Waffen-SS units, but these numbers were never decisive and were relatively minuscule when set against the scale of the ongoing war. To expect the Nazi regime to broadly conscript the conquered peoples of Europe for its war effort fundamentally misunderstood two key points. First, Hitler was not a leader who envisioned a benevolent or unified coalition of nations. His policy of racial warfare aimed to subjugate those he deemed lesser races of Europe. Rather than merging the continent into a harmonious union, his ideology sought to exploit and strip mine occupied territories to make way for the expansion of the German populace. Many citizens of these occupied nations were considered unworthy of even sustenance, let alone the privilege of bearing arms and fighting for their future. Secondly, the willingness of these subjugated populations to support Hitler's aggressive campaigns was exceedingly low. By 1941, it was becoming increasingly evident that only total domination would satisfy the ambitions of the Nazi leadership. Resistance movements were beginning to organize in many countries, receiving support and aid from the British. Notably, by May of 1941, the first British organized resistance group had formed in France, marking just one aspect of the continent-wide resistance against the Nazis, much of which received little to no assistance from the Allies. When considering these various factors, it becomes clear that they collectively undermined the Nazis' ambitions. The Wehrmacht's declining ability to mobilize replacements would continue to haunt the Ostseil, that being the Eastern Army, as the war progressed, leaving a lingering legacy of manpower shortages that would shape the course of the conflict. And not to go too far off topic here, but since I am, the Pacific War guy, I always find it fascinating how both Japan and Germany made the exact same mistake when it came to incorporating foreign peoples into their service. Both had their own racial takes. For Hitler, for example, it's pretty simplistic. The war in the East was one of extermination. Hitler envisioned the brutal butchering of most of the Slavic people whom he considered Untermenschen. Those who survived, if any, would have been thralls to German settlers in the east. Japan, it's a bit more complex. Long story short, a man named Kanji Ishiwara sort of came about with this Pan-Asia concept that was bastardized by those like Hideki Tojo into the infamous Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Now, on paper, this was supposed to be the incorporation of all different Asian groups under the leadership of the Japanese to be more or less a bulwark against the Western evils. In reality, many Japanese viewed other Asian groups as Untermenschen and sought to reign them over, rather tyrannically. The absolute horror and abuse the conquered peoples of Asia faced under Japan is pretty on point with what happened on the Eastern Front, although the Japanese did not establish units whose sole purpose was genocide. Both Germany and Japan utterly failed to enlist numerous potential peoples because of their brutal mistreatment of them, and it was to their own detriment. On the Eastern Front, there were countless people who were very, very, very unhappy with the USSR. Take a look at the Ukrainians who underwent the Holodomor. It would not have taken too much to get the Ukrainians on board, but instead of showing up as liberators, the Germans unleashed brutality upon them. Likewise, with Japan, many Asiatic people facing Western imperialism, take, for example, the Malayans or the Vietnamese, could have been ripe pickings to become turncoats. But that was just my 2 cents on the issue. Back to our story at hand, the Yelna salient emerged as a focal point for attention from Army Group North, as the conditions on the battlefield intensified. In the waning days of July, the Red Army escalated its pressure on the German troops holding the front lines. By the time August arrived, the battle for the critical river crossings had expanded far beyond its tactical significance, morphing into a fierce contest of wills, with neither side willing to concede defeat. The struggle devolved into a desperate and chaotic flinging of troops into the breaches of the enemy lines. For hours and often days, artillery fire echoed across the battlefield, mixing with the sounds of conflict as each side clung to its positions. Occasional breaks in the German lines could only be patched up by hastily assembled scratch forces, scrounging from the rear areas, desperately trying to shore up defenses. Meanwhile, the main pocket at Smolensk was still under immense pressure, with the Ninth Army bearing the brunt of the effort to compress this encircled area. They faced fierce resistance from the Soviet soldiers trapped within, who were proving remarkably tenacious, refusing to die easily. As the Soviets withdrew under pressure, they encountered units from the 7th Panzer Division on the eastern side of the encirclement. Typically, the situation would have favored the Germans, but the 7th Panzer was already stretched to its limits, desperately trying to defend its positions against relentless onslaughts from the Soviet 16th Army. To the north, the 19th and 30th Armies continued their assaults, systematically crushing the remnants of the 39th Panzer Corps, and preventing any reinforcements from reaching the critical pinch point of the pocket. Everything that Field Marshal Theodor von Bock had at his disposal was already engaged in combat or tasked with defending other valuable sections of the line. There was no reserves to spare. On the afternoon of August the 1st, just 5 days after the pocket had been sealed, the German line finally broke. In response to this alarming setback, Bock immediately issued orders for the 20th Motorized Infantry Division, commanded by General George Hans Reinhardt, and Guderian's 17th Panzer Division, tried to close the gap. However, long-simmering tensions amongst the commanders began to surface, culminating in a dispute over responsibility for the breakthrough and delayed responses. Neither commander was convinced that their men could handle the fierce fighting that lay ahead, a moment of hesitation that could have dire consequences for the unfolding battle. This moment stands in stark contrast to previous disagreements that had characterized the hot-headed panzer commanders early in the war. In the campaigns in France, officers frequently engaged in heated arguments, often driven by fervent desire to win glory on the battlefield. These conflicts typically centered around disobeying orders, prioritizing caution, or maintaining vital lines of communication. There was no shortage of ambitious commanders eager to push their own men deeper into enemy territory in pursuit of swift and easy victories, demonstrating a strong inclination to take risks and exploit any perceived weakness in the enemy. However, as the harsh realities of the warfare set in on the Eastern Front, many of the so-called heroes of the French campaign began to find excuses for their inability or unwillingness to take responsibility when faced with adversity. This shift highlighted a significant change in the mentality of some of these leaders. Rather than boldly advancing, they hesitated when the stakes were high and the situation deteriorated. Their resolve appeared to wane as the fighting intensified and the prospect of defeat loomed larger on the horizon. In essence, while the early phase of the war saw commanders eager to charge ahead, the tough conditions on the Eastern Front brought forth a different breed of leadership, marked by self-doubt, a reluctance to make bold decisions. This shift from offensive bravado to defensive defensiveness underscored the psychological toll that the prolonged conflict could exact on military leaders, revealing the complexities of command in the face of overwhelming challenges. On July the 30th, Adolf Hitler issued a new war directive that aimed to rectify his earlier command from the 22nd regarding the division of the 2nd and 3rd Panzer Groups of Army Group Center. This earlier order had sought to redistribute panzer forces between Army Group North and Army Group South in order to secure key strategic objectives in Ukraine and Leningrad. However, that directive had faced stern opposition and sparked significant strategic disagreements amongst the German high command, discussions that underscored the fracturing unity within the Nazi leadership. The individual accounts of soldiers enduring the relentless hardships of the Eastern Front provided a stark insight into their torment. On June the 30th, infantryman Bernhard Reiter lamented that substantive rest periods were a thing of the past, which, following his strenuous battles, he declared were urgently necessary. On that same day, another soldier, Harold Henley, wrote home detailing a grueling march of 44 kilometers, during which he engaged in a battle, and he was ordered to carry a 14-kilogram ammunition box cross-country for nearly 3 hours. He conveyed his exhaustion in poignant terms. "I was completely worn out, exhausted to the last reserve." Just 4 days later, Henry expressed the terrible strain he was under after another march of 45 kilometers. His letter painted a vivid picture of his suffering. "We're wet through all over. Sweat is running down our faces in wide streams. Not just sweat, but sometimes tears too. Tears of helpless rage, desperation, and pain, squeezed out of us by this inhuman effort. No one can tell me that someone who isn't an infantryman can possibly imagine what we're going through here." Alexander Kors, in his diary entry set on July the 1st, recounted the grim toll of their relentless march, reporting the loss of 3 men from his company, one of whom had died. He noted that these losses were not as a consequence of the battle, but from exhaustion resulting from exertions. Kors reflected on the physical and mental rigors they had faced during their journey, concluding, "Towards the end, when one is fighting painfully against collapse, one occasionally hears words of suicide." Helmut Pabst voiced his frustration, commenting, "This marching is more strenuous than action." Another infantryman marching with Army Group North described slipping into a state that he labeled quasi-sleepwalk. He explained how he became entranced by the steady rhythm of marching boots in front of him, only momentarily waking when he stumbled into the body ahead. This is actually something that I've read quite often from primary sources during World War I. The adjutant to the divisional commander of the 7th Panzer Division recalled after the war that during the initial weeks of Barbarossa, the inhuman hardships faced by the infantry invoked feelings of sympathy amongst the higher ranks. Heinrich Happe vividly captured the dire conditions on their march. With dry, cracked lips, red eyes, and dust-covered faces, the men marched eastward with only one wish, to lie down for just a few hours' rest. But the march continued relentlessly over roads and tracks, through woods and open fields. Each man's war at this stage was circumscribed by the next few steps he would take, the hardness of the road, the soreness of his feet, the dryness of his tongue, and the weight of his equipment. Beckoning him on was the thought of the next halt, just to stop, to have no need to put one foot in front of the other for a few hours. That was a dream of every man. While the experience of marching presented its own agonies, Happe also alluded to more grueling fates for many infantrymen, the so-called push commandos. 2 to 3 sections from each company were selected for this task, specifically assigned to support the heaviest wagons in the supply train. Happe explained the ordeal. As soon as a wagon slowed down, the men would spring forward, grab the spokes, and throw their weight forward to keep the wheels moving. The men stripped off their tunics and shirts with sweat pouring down their backs as the red dust settled on them and caked hard. One squad would be relieved from its push commando duties by another, and they would find blessing relief in the marching. A new directive clarified that both the 2nd and 3rd Panzer Groups should be withdrawn from the front lines for a vital 10-day rest period. The directive to delay the operations was intended to provide the panzers with a crucial opportunity for refitting before they were dispatched to assist their comrades in Army Group North and Army Group South. Specifically, Panzer Group 2 was slated for transfer to Army Group South to facilitate the capture of Kiev and the destruction of all Red units positioned west of the Don River. This ambitious undertaking aimed to secure a decisive victory in Ukraine, but Hitler viewed it as a task no more daunting than what Army Group Center had previously achieved with 2 panzer groups during their swift advance across France. Meanwhile, Panzer Group 3 was designated to support Army Group North in its operations directed towards Leningrad. Significantly, the directive made no mention of capturing the city itself. Instead, Hitler had already determined a strategy centered on starving out Leningrad, pushing them into submission through a protracted siege. This approach reflected a shift in tactics, prioritizing attrition over rapid conquest, and underscored the evolving nature of the German strategic perspective as they faced fierce Soviet resistance. This pause was intended as an opportunity to recuperate the fatigued troops, repair the damaged tanks, and resupply their units in anticipation of future operations. Unfortunately, regardless of Hitler's intentions or the tactical rationale behind this order, it starkly highlighted the disconnect between Hitler and the military realities faced by his commanders on the ground. At this critical juncture, there was simply no possibility to pull back the panzers. They were deeply engaged in fending off a massive Soviet counteroffensive, while simultaneously struggling to maintain control and contain at least 9 intact divisions that were trapped within the now open Smolensk pocket. The urgency of the situation required immediate attention and decisive action, but the order for the rest period reflected a dangerous naivety that could jeopardize the entire operation and leave German forces vulnerable to encirclement and further attacks. As July came to a close, Army Group North found itself grappling with the challenges of organizing a proper assault on Leningrad. The widening funnel shape of the front was most acutely felt in the northern sector, where Field Marshal Wilhelm von Leeb commanded the smallest army group. His forces were contending with some of the roughest terrain along the Baltic coast, complicating their operations further. As early as the middle of July, senior German officers had recognized the problems of the advance. On July the 16th, Hopna wrote to his wife, "The deciding cause remains our weakness. The number of divisions is as inadequate as their equipment. The men are tired, the losses increase, the fallout rate of vehicles rises." While the Soviet Northwestern Front had initially surrendered the border areas without much resistance, their resolve began to stiffen as they approached Leningrad. In the previous podcast, we witnessed how General Vasily Vatutin decisively ravaged Manstein's 56th Panzer Corps, signaling troubling times ahead of the soldiers of Army Group North. However, at that moment, they were engaged in cleanup operations in Estonia, trying to sort out their logistics as they awaited the arrival of the 3rd Panzer Group, which was finishing off the remnants in Smolensk after completing its own refit period. While the 3rd Panzer Group was already supporting Army Group North with the 57th Panzer Corps, commanded by General Panzers Kutzen, it remained under the nominal control of Army Group Center. They were primarily focused on securing that Army Group's flank, but this fighting served as a prelude to the eventual subordination of the 2nd Panzer Group to Army Group North, an essential step for Leeb to feel secure enough to launch a full-scale offensive on Leningrad. Since the middle of July, Velkaya Luki had become the center of a protracted battle. The fighting around Velkaya Luki is often overshadowed in narratives of the Eastern Front due to the simultaneous massive encirclement battles at Smolensk and Uman. However, it is essential to recognize Velkaya Luki for its strategic value and the stiff resistance offered by the Soviet forces there. The town's possession was crucial for the Germans as it secured the flank of Army Group North at Smolensk, preventing potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited by Soviet counteroffensives. Furthermore, Velkaya Luki served as an important waypoint for Army Group North as they redirected their efforts northward towards the assault upon Leningrad. Capturing this town was not merely about immediate tactical gains, as it represented a broader strategic maneuver that facilitated the planned advances in ongoing campaigns, demonstrating the town's significant role in the larger operational framework of the Eastern Front. At times it involved several divisions, and by the first week of August, General Hoth was beginning to concentrate all available forces to secure the area. Although it would still be a few weeks before he could initiate his attack, Hoth spent the initial week attempting to pull his men out of the line in Smolensk, rest and refit them, and progressively move them up to prepare for the impending assault on Velkaya Luki. As for the rest of Army Group North, the tactical plan for the assault on Leningrad was nearing completion. Air reinforcements were committed to the area, including the 8th Air Corps, which had been retasked for Army Group Center to bolster the aerial support for the operation. Alongside this, the 3rd Panzer Group, which was also receiving a much-needed rest period during the first week of August, there was little to no hope that these reinforcements would provide the necessary strength for a decisive final push against the Soviet positions. At this stage, there was no immediate plans to launch a direct assault through the city itself. The initial objective was to simply encircle Leningrad. The timing of this decision to besiege the city remained somewhat fluid, as the orders directed at this point focused on encircling it. Presumably, the final decision on how to approach an assault could be made later on, after the city was finally surrounded. With these strategic adjustments, Army Group North was tasked with executing 2 main thrusts. The principal effort would be spearheaded by 3 task forces, constructed primarily from the 18th Army and the 3rd Panzer Group, which would attack along a wide front stretching roughly 300 kilometers between the Nava River and Lake Ilmen. This coordinated advance aimed to penetrate Soviet defenses and secure critical positions around Leningrad. Simultaneously, a smaller secondary attack was planned to take place south of Lake Ilmen, involving the entirety of the 16th Army. This dual approach aimed to exert pressure on multiple fronts, maximizing the chances of breaking through Soviet lines and setting the stage for a successful encirclement of the city. The 3 task forces of the main effort were organized into northern, central, and southern groups, each with specific objectives aimed at enveloping Leningrad. The northern group, commanded by General Panzers Reinhardt, included the 41st Panzer Corps and the 38th Infantry Corps from the 18th Army, led by General of Infantry Jalpus. Their objective was to launch an offensive across the Luga River, with the goal of capturing the town of Kingzep, thereby securing a critical position in front of Leningrad and facilitating further advances. The central group was to consist solely of Manstein's corps, which was tasked with taking Luga and subsequently attacking Leningrad from the south. This focused effort aimed to create a breakthrough that could lead to encirclement and cutoff of the city from reinforcements and resupply. The southern group of the main effort was responsible for advancing through Novgorod and eventually isolating Leningrad from the east. To achieve this, the group was composed of 2 infantry corps from the 16th Army, the 28th and the 1st Infantry Corps. The coordinated assault was designed not only to push towards Novgorod, but also to establish a stronghold that would further restrict Soviet movements and logistical support to Leningrad. Together, these task forces represented a concerted effort to surround and subdue Leningrad, leveraging the strengths of both panzers and infantry units to overcome Soviet defenses and initiate a siege. South of Lake Yemen, the 16th Army had been significantly reinforced with the attachment of the 22nd and 50th Corps drawn from Army Group North, and the OKH Reserves, respectively. These reinforcements joined forces with the 2nd and 10th Infantry Corps, collectively forming a robust attack force aimed at pushing eastward to drive back the Soviet armies into the sector. The main objective was to create a buffer zone essential for the encirclement of Leningrad. Opposing them were the combined forces of 4 Soviet armies, the 11th, 22nd, 27th, and 34th Armies, all of which occupied very well-prepared defensive positions along the crucial railway line connecting Moscow to Leningrad. This railway line was vital for Soviet logistics and troop movements, making the task of breaching their defenses even more challenging for the Germans. The first week of August was critical for Army Group North as they worked to get their forces into position for the massive attack. It was a true all-or-nothing assault. The need for success was paramount. Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb had committed his entire army group to this operation, leaving no strategic reserves to call upon in case of setbacks. The only support available were 3 lightly equipped security divisions designed to hold the rear. However, security divisions were not intended for frontline combat, and they lacked the necessary support or even firepower to withstand prolonged engagements in the heat of battle. Lieb understood that he had to make the attack succeed with the forces at hand. Failure to do so could jeopardize not only the assault on Leningrad, but the overall strategic position of the German forces in the Eastern Front. During a visit by General Paulus to Army Group North on July 26, the armored commanders of Panzer Group 4, including Generals Hoppner, Manstein, and Reinhardt, all reached a consensus that the terrain between Lake Ilmen and Lake Peipus was ill-suited for armored warfare. This assessment, coupled with unyielding resistance from the Soviet forces, led Field Marshal von Leber to deem the continued advance of Manstein's 56th Corps as very unfavorable. In contrast, General Reinhardt's 41st Panzer Corps was slightly better positioned, though it was momentarily halted and had incurred heavy losses. Confronting these significant challenges, Manstein bluntly communicated the situation to Paulus. I informed him about the battles we had fought to date and emphasized how run down our panzer corps had become in an environment that was most unsuitable for the use of armored troops. The losses amongst our corps, 3 mobile divisions, had already reached 6,000 men, and both the troops and their equipment were under excessive strain. I told Paulus that, in my view, the most sensible course of action would be to withdraw the entire panzer group from an area where a rapid advance was nearly impossible and redirect it straight towards Moscow. Unlike his decisive influence in shaping German strategy in 1940, Manstein found himself without direct access to Hitler, and he faced the daunting task of arguing against Hitler's entrenched ideas rather than supporting them, as he had in his previous campaigns. One individual who emerged as indispensable as an ally to General Halder in advocating for a shift in focus to Moscow was General Alfred Jodl. While the extent of his influence is difficult to measure, Jodl's support for the Moscow campaign was significant, not only because of the arguments he presented, but also due to the weight of his office. The rivalry between the OKW and the OKH added credibility to their collective cause as they found themselves aligned in their views, rather than competing for Hitler's favor. The only exception was Keitel, who, due to his loyalty to Hitler, refrained from involving himself in the dispute, except to relay the general's complaints to the Führer. Predictably, Keitel's own position was never in doubt, largely because of his notorious fidelity to Hitler, which also meant that his opinions were seldom sought. In Vademont's account, Jodl was depicted as a pivotal figure in Hitler's headquarters, advocating for the OKH's position. The opposition to Hitler's strategy had transformed into a unified chorus amongst key figures in the OKW, the entire OKH, and nearly all the relevant field commanders. During scheduled discussions or in private moments with Hitler, Vademont claimed that Jodl found a soft spot and seized the opportunity to advocate for an attack on Moscow. This confrontation had taken place on July the 27th when Jodl presented arguments centered not on the strategic value of capturing the Soviet capital, as Halder had stressed, but rather on the belief that the remaining strength of the Red Army had to be confronted and defeated at said critical location. This approach cleverly echoed Hitler's own reasoning that the enemy must be destroyed wherever they were found. In typical fashion, Hitler countered with his familiar arguments, highlighting the economic importance of securing the Ukraine and Caucasus. Nevertheless, Jodl's vocal intervention proved a crucial element in the debate, because on the following day, as Vademont noted, probably due to the weight of the new unfavorable situation reports coming in from Army Group Center and North, Hitler suddenly seemed prepared to abandon his large-scale operations in the south. The extent of Jodl's influence in swaying Hitler's decisions remains uncertain. However, he undeniably provided an influential voice against the prevailing strategy. The effect of the ongoing debate on Hitler was not always evident behind his steely demeanor in daily situation reports and unequivocal language towards the generals. Nevertheless, the burden of indecision about how to proceed weighed heavily upon him. On July the 28th, during a brief walk with his army adjutant Major Gerhard Engel and his chief military adjutant, Colonel Rudolf Schmundt, Hitler shared rare insights into his private thoughts. Engel later recounted that Hitler confided he was losing sleep at night because he was, quote, not yet clear about things. He revealed that he felt torn between political objectives and economic goals within the Soviet Union. Politically, he felt compelled to capture Leningrad and Moscow, yet economically securing der Lebensraum in the south, in his words, where the honey and milk flow, was crucial. The following day, on July 29th, during a visit to Panzer Group 2, Schmundt conveyed to Guderian that Hitler's indecisiveness regarding the war's direction persisted. The 3 objectives under consideration, Leningrad, Moscow, and Ukraine, vied for attention, but according to Schmundt, no final decision had been made. In his memoirs, Guderian asserted that he had urged the case for Moscow to Schmundt, with all the force of which I was capable. Now, looking south, the amount encirclement, which had been the primary objective of Army Group South during the last 2 weeks of July, was finally completed. However, the mere accomplishment of encircling enemy forces did not signify the end of a battle. Similar to the situation at Smolensk, the Red Army was not prepared to surrender easily. Although the Wehrmacht had successfully surrounded them, the Soviets took this as a cue to intensify the resistance. The fight to eliminate the remnants trapped in the Uman pocket continued into the first week of August. The Soviet 6th and 12th Armies, crucial ground forces in the region, found themselves unknowingly divided from one another. This disconnection significantly hampered their coordination as each army struggled to navigate back towards reunion. While the 6th Army attempted to push eastward, the 12th Army sought a route south. In a concerted effort, General Kleist's panzers collaborated closely with the infantry divisions of the 6th and 17th Armies, as well as the Hungarian Mobile Corps. This synchronization allowed them to effectively isolate and crush the Soviet forces as they desperately sought a way to escape from the encirclement. By August the 7th, the battle was decisively over. The Red Army had officially lost 2 field armies in these encirclement battles spanning July and into early August. In the aftermath of the fighting around Uman, the Germans recorded over 100,000 prisoners taken. Many of these men faced uncertain futures, as they were destined to be sent westward to become prison laborers. They would contribute to the war effort by aiding in the production of weapons intended for the very invasion of their homeland. Over on the left flank of Army Group South, General Reichenau's 6th Army was positioned somewhat south of Kiev, tasked with securing the Army Group's left flank. With new Soviet field armies being mobilized to reinforce the southwestern front, Reichenau maintained vigilance while his comrades focused on the ongoing battle over Uman. Amongst these new formations, the 37th Army stationed at Kiev posed a significant threat, yet Reichenau had only 1 infantry corps available to counter it. Meanwhile, the 5th Army, under Major General Potapov, was positioned to the southwest of Kiev, where Reichenau was deploying 2 infantry corps to maintain the defensive line. In Moscow, Stalin, through the Stavka, was vocally chastising individual field army commanders for their performance. This was characteristic of the dictator's style in the early part of the war, though he came to allow the chain of command to work in the later years of the war. Hitler was much the opposite. As the war dragged on, he displayed less respect for the military hierarchy, often ordering corps and division commanders personally. He demanded that the 5th Army launch an offensive against the flank of Army Group South to provide assistance to the 6th and 12th Armies besieged at Uman. Although it was too late to salvage the situation by midweek, Potapov reluctantly obeyed the orders and initiated an attack. However, after several days of heavy fighting, the offensive was simply called off, resulting in substantial Soviet losses without any meaningful gains. Adding to the Soviet woes, the German 17th Infantry Corps successfully captured Korosten, marking a significant setback and further embarrassment during an already disastrous week for the Soviet war effort in Ukraine. As the sun set on August 7th, the outlook was quite grim across the Eastern Front, potentially for both sides. While Smolensk had been forced back open, the costs in men and material had been staggering. It was becoming increasingly clear that the Germans would soon succeed in closing the pocket around the encircled Soviet forces. The liquidation of the 6th and 12th Armies in the region further highlighted the dire situation for the Red Army. Moreover, Batutin's recent successes in the north, although initially promising, were likely to attract more German attention to his sector. As preparations for the next phase of Operation Barbarossa got underway, cities like Leningrad, Kiev, and Moscow braced for the impact of the German advance, aware that the coming days would likely bring renewed onslaughts from the Wehrmacht. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/Kings. And hey, don't forget our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. And after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. If you'd like to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/PacificWarChannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. Despite encircling Smolensk, Soviet forces regrouped, showcasing resilience. As casualty numbers soared, the illusion of a swift German victory faded. They struggled with stretched supply lines and manpower shortages while the Soviets rapidly mobilized new divisions. Notably, as the Germans pushed towards Leningrad, their strategy faltered amidst heavy losses. The chaotic battles revealed the stark reality of war. Behind every German triumph loomed a growing Soviet spirit, destined to reshape the Eastern Front and alter the course of the war.